My name is Amelia Wilson. I'm 67, and just hours after my husband's funeral, my own son told me I wouldn't see a penny of his $38 million inheritance. What he didn't know was that my husband, my Victor, had left behind one final sealed box that held a secret that would not only change my fortune, but would force me to fight for my very identity. It's a long story, full of heartache and unexpected turns, but it's one I feel I have to tell. I'm sitting here in my study as the evening draws in, the sky turning a soft shade of violet. I can't help but wonder where you are as you read this. What country are you in? What time is it for you? Drop me a comment below if you feel like it. It makes this big, lonely world feel a little smaller, a little friendlier. And right now, that means more to me than you can imagine. The air in the lawyer's waiting room was heavy and still, thick with the scent of old paper, lemon polish, and the kind of unspoken tension that clings to places where fortunes are decided. It was a room designed to intimidate, with its dark mahogany paneling and oil portraits of stern-faced men in powdered wigs who seemed to judge every soul who entered. All I felt, however, was cold. It was a deep, invasive chill that had settled into my bones the moment my husband Victor had taken his last breath 3 days ago. It was a cold that even my heavy black wool coat couldn't touch. My son, Richard, paced in front of the tall, mullioned window, a caged animal in a bespoke suit. He was 40 years old, a man with a wife and a life of his own, but in that moment, he looked like a petulant, overgrown teenager waiting for his allowance. His expensive navy blue suit, the very one he'd worn to deliver a brief, emotionless eulogy at the funeral, seemed too tight across his broad shoulders, straining with his restless, impatient energy. He wasn't grieving. He was anticipating. He was a runner at the starting line, coiled and ready to sprint towards the finish line, his inheritance. He hadn't offered me his arm as we climbed the steep, echoing marble stairs to the fourth-floor offices of Alcott & Sons. He hadn't so much as glanced my way to see if I, a woman of 67, in the first days of her widowhood, was managing the climb. He just forged ahead, his polished Italian shoes clicking a brisk, demanding rhythm on the stone. I was an afterthought, a shadow trailing in his wake, a necessary but inconvenient piece of the day's legal proceedings, a prop in the drama of his own enrichment. Finally, his pacing ceased. He strode over to the leather armchair beside the one where I sat, rigid and silent, and dropped into it. The chair sighed under his weight, a sound of protest in the quiet room. He leaned in close, so close I could see the tiny, broken capillaries around his nose, the result of too many late nights and expensive brandies. His cologne, a sharp, spicy scent he'd adopted in his 30s to seem more corporate, invaded my personal space, making my stomach churn. "Mom," he whispered, his voice a low, conspiratory hiss that was somehow more piercing than a shout. "I just want you to be prepared. Dad and I had a lot of talks, especially near the end. He knew I was the one to carry on the legacy. He was very clear about his intentions." He paused, letting the words hang in the air between us like a toxic vapor. "You won't see a penny of the $38 million. He made sure it was all protected for the future of the company, for me." I didn't flinch. I didn't gasp. I didn't give him the satisfaction of a reaction. I simply turned my head and looked at him. My son. The baby I had held against my chest, marveling at his tiny, perfect fingers. The boy whose nightmares I had soothed, whose scraped knees I had bandaged. The young man whose exorbitant college tuition we had paid without complaint, assuming it was an investment in his character, not just his career. His eyes, the same deep, commanding brown as his father's, held no sympathy, no shared sorrow for the man we had both just buried. They held only a cold, triumphant glint. He was assessing me, expecting tears, an argument, a plea. He wanted a fight, something to justify the callousness of his words. I would not give it to him.
My silence seemed to unnerve him more than any outburst could have. It was a language he didn't understand. I simply turned my gaze back to my hands, clasped tightly in my lap. The skin on them was thin and dotted with the brown spots of age, but they were strong hands. They were the hands that typed Victor's first business plans late into the night, packed 1,000 school lunches, sewn on 100 buttons, and held our family together for 45 tumultuous years. They had built an empire just as surely as Victor's brilliant mind had, and my son, my own flesh and blood, saw none of it. To him, I was just Mom, an old woman in a black dress who was now a minor obstacle on his path to immense wealth. The heavy office door opened and a man who looked as old and distinguished as the furniture entered. Philip Elcott was Victor's lawyer, and, once decades ago, a good friend to us both. His face was etched with the carefully practiced lines of professional sympathy, but his eyes, when they met mine, held a flicker of something else, genuine warmth, and, perhaps, a hint of pity. "Amelia, Richard, please come in," he said, his voice a gravelly baritone that commanded attention. We followed him into his private office. It was even more imposing than the waiting room. A massive, gleaming mahogany desk dominated the space, and behind it, floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of the bustling city below, a kingdom Victor had helped build. On the desk, beside a neat, intimidating stack of legal documents bound in blue, sat a small, unadorned wooden box. It was old, crafted from a dark cherry wood that had deepened with age, and it was sealed with a thick, prominent dollop of red wax, imprinted with the familiar crest of Victor's signet ring. "Philip, what's this?" Richard asked, nodding towards the box with a dismissive air as if it were a trivial, sentimental trinket left behind by an old man. "A final instruction from your father," Philip said, his gaze steady and unwavering. "It was very clear. It is to be opened only after the primary articles of the will have been read." Richard shrugged, a smirk playing on his lips. He shot me a look, a silent, smug message that screamed, "See, just a sentimental old fool." He thought he knew everything. He thought the game was already won. I watched him settle into his plush leather chair, the very picture of a man who believed the world was about to be served to him on a silver platter. I remained silent, my heart a heavy, steady drum against my ribs. I didn't know what was in that box, but I knew my husband. And Victor, for all his business-first mentality, was never a sentimental fool. He was a strategist to his very core. Every move he made had a purpose.
As Philip Alcott cleared his throat, the rustle of the crisp, heavy pages of the will sounding unnaturally loud in the silent office, my mind began to drift. It floated away from the sterile, high-stakes present and back to a time that felt like another life, another world. The scent of old paper and expensive leather faded, replaced by a memory so vivid I could almost taste it. The smell of fresh paint, sawdust, and cheap, strong coffee in our very first apartment. It was a tiny one-bedroom walk-up in a less than fashionable part of town, with pipes that rattled like angry ghosts and a view of a graffiti-covered brick wall. To me, it had been a palace. I saw a younger version of myself, my hair tied up in a colorful scarf to keep the dust out of it, sitting at our small, wobbly kitchen table. The table itself was a testament to our life then, covered not with food, but with Victor's dreams, spread out in a chaotic but hopeful mess of blueprints, ledgers, and notes scribbled on napkins. He was going to build an engine component, a new kind of fuel injector that was more efficient than anything on the market. Everyone, from the bank loan officers to his own father, said he was crazy. His father, a man who valued security above all else, had pleaded with him to get a steady job with a pension at the post office. But I believed in him. I saw the fire in his eyes, the genius in his chaotic scribbles. I remembered the weight of his head on my shoulder as he fell asleep right there at that table, utterly exhausted and defeated after another potential investor had practically laughed him out of their office.
I'd gently wake him, guide him to our small bedroom, and then return to the table myself. While the city slept, I would spend hours organizing his notes, typing up his proposals on a secondhand typewriter, and trying to make sense of the columns of numbers that represented our hopes and our mounting debts. My own dream had been a small, quiet one. I wanted to open a flower shop. I had a knack for it, a genuine love for bringing color and life into a space. I found a strange peace in the simple act of arranging stems and petals into something beautiful. I'd even saved up a little money, a few $100s, a fortune to us then, tucked away in an old shoebox in the back of my closet. But then Victor's prototype needed a crucial part, a custom machined gear that he couldn't afford. The entire project, his entire dream, was stalled for the lack of one small piece of metal. Without a moment's hesitation, I went to the closet, retrieved the shoebox, and brought it to him. "This is for the gear," I'd said simply, placing the roll of bills in his hand. He stared at me, his eyes wide with a mixture of hope and guilt. "Amelia, no, this is your flower shop money. We talked about this." "The flowers can wait," I'd replied, closing his calloused hand over the cash. "Your dream can't." The flower shop, of course, never happened. His dream took off like a rocket, and my life became about supporting that incredible, terrifying trajectory. I was the launch pad, the ground control, the steadying force he always knew was there, waiting for him when he returned from the stratosphere of high-stakes business. Another memory, sharper and more complex, pushed the older one aside. It was from about 15 years ago. Wilson Motors was already a formidable force in the industry. Victor was in the middle of negotiating a massive merger, a deal that would double the company's size and make him a legend. He was stressed, working around the clock with a team of high-priced lawyers and accountants from a firm that charged by the minute. One evening, he brought a heavy briefcase full of documents home, his face a mask of deep, gnawing frustration. "Something isn't right, Ames," he muttered, pacing the length of our enormous living room and rubbing his temples. He fell asleep on the plush sofa an hour later, the binder lying open on his chest. I couldn't rest. An old, familiar energy stirred in me. I picked up the thick binder, the one filled with the other company's convoluted financial reports. I wasn't an accountant. My formal education had ended after 2 years of community college. But I had spent years managing our increasingly complex household budget, stretching every dollar and learning to read between the lines of any contract, from a plumber's estimate to an insurance policy. I sat in his large leather armchair, a cup of tea growing cold by my side, and I read. I read until 3 in the morning, tracing the columns of figures with my finger, just as I had done all those years ago at our wobbly kitchen table. And then I saw it. It wasn't a glaring error. It was a footnote, a tiny, almost invisible asterisk leading to a page of dense, legalistic jargon about unfunded pension liabilities. The way they had structured it, it looked like a future asset, a tax write-off. But I saw through the clever wording. It was a ticking time bomb of debt, a massive financial obligation to their retirees that they had skillfully hidden from view. His whole team of 6-figure experts had missed it. The next morning, I placed a fresh cup of coffee and the open report in front of him as he sat at the breakfast table. I pointed to the footnote. "Here," I said quietly, "read this, and then look at the employee roster and their average age on page 97. The numbers don't add up." He frowned, initially annoyed at my intrusion into his world. He read it once, then twice. The color drained from his face. He spent the next hour on the phone in his study, his voice growing louder and harder with each call. He'd walked back into the kitchen, looked at me with an expression I hadn't seen in years. Awe. Pure, unadulterated awe. "You just saved this company, Amelia. You just saved me from the biggest mistake of my life," he'd said, his voice thick with an emotion he rarely showed. He never mentioned it to anyone else. The deal was aggressively renegotiated in our favor. Victor was hailed as a genius, a shark in the financial papers. I went back to planning charity galas and managing the household staff. But something had been planted that day, a seed of knowledge. He knew what I was capable of, even if he never said it out loud again, even if I myself had started to forget. And to my son, Richard Victor Wilson, Philip Alcott's voice snapped me back to the present with a jolt. I blinked, the ghosts of the past receding, leaving me once again in the cold, quiet room with my son, who was now leaning forward in his chair, his entire body thrumming with a greedy, undisguised anticipation. And to my son, Richard Victor Wilson, I bequeath the family mansion on Lakeview Drive and all its contents, furnishings, and art to be his and his heirs in perpetuity.
A slow, triumphant smile spread across Richard's face like a stain. He leaned back in his chair, the expensive leather groaning in protest, and shot a look over his shoulder at his wife, Jennifer, who was sitting slightly behind him like a lady-in-waiting. She gave a small, approving nod, her perfectly manicured hand patting his shoulder in a gesture of shared victory. The mansion was more than a house. It was a symbol, a palace of new money that they had both coveted for years. It was the stage upon which they planned to live out their lives of consequence. To them, it was the ultimate prize. Furthermore, Philip continued, his voice as even and dispassionate as a metronome, I bequeath the sum of $500,000 to be transferred to him immediately without condition. Richard's smile widened into a grin. He let out a short, sharp laugh, a sound of pure, unadulterated relief and victory. He looked directly at me, his eyebrows raised in a gesture that said, See, what did I tell you? He was so sure of himself, so wrapped up in his own narrative of being the chosen son, the rightful heir destined to take the throne. He believed the play was over, the curtain falling on his grand coronation. I held his gaze, my expression a carefully constructed mask of neutrality. I gave him nothing. No tears, no anger, no flicker of the deep disappointment that was churning in my gut. My stillness was a blank wall he couldn't seem to penetrate, and I could see a flicker of frustration in his eyes. He wanted me to be vanquished, to weep and wail. My composure denied him the full sweetness of his triumph. He turned back to the lawyer, his tone suddenly magnanimous, like a king addressing a loyal courtier. Thank you, Philip. That's very generous. Dad was always a great man. Now, about the rest of it. The company stock, the investment portfolio, the $37.5 million. Obviously, that all comes to me as the sole remaining director. We can just expedite the paperwork to make the transition smooth. Ahem, Philip Alcott interrupted. He didn't raise his voice, he simply cleared his throat and held up a single, commanding finger. The sound, though quiet, cut through Richard's entitled monologue like a razor. The will is very specific, Richard. The disposition of the remaining assets of the estate, which includes the controlling 65% stake in Wilson Motors and all associated financial portfolios, is subject to a special clause. Richard's smile faltered, then vanished. A special clause? What are you talking about? Dad never mentioned any clause. Philip didn't answer him directly. Instead, he reached out with a slow, deliberate movement and placed his hand flat on the old wooden box. The gesture was theatrical and deeply unsettling. A clause, he repeated, his voice dropping slightly, imbuing the word with a heavy significance. Contained herein. The atmosphere in the room shifted instantly. The air, already tense, crackled with a new, sharp energy. Richard's bravado evaporated, replaced with a flicker of confusion, which quickly morphed into suspicion. This is ridiculous, he snapped, his voice suddenly tight and defensive. What is this, some kind of posthumous game? Dad wouldn't do this. He was a straightforward man. "Your father was a man of many layers, Richard," Philip said calmly, his eyes never leaving my son's face. "And he was nothing if not meticulous in his planning." Jennifer, who had been a silent, smiling statue until now, leaned forward, her perfectly glossed lips close to her husband's ear. I couldn't hear the words, but I could see the sudden panic in her eyes. The silver platter was being pulled away, and she didn't understand why. Her dream of redecorating the mansion's ballroom was suddenly in jeopardy. My own heart, which had been beating a slow, funereal rhythm, had begun to beat a little bit faster. I had no idea what Victor had planned, but for the first time since he had died, a tiny, unfamiliar spark ignited in the cold emptiness of my grief. It wasn't hope, not yet. It was a fierce, burning curiosity. It was the feeling that the story I thought I knew, the one where I faded quietly into the background of my own life, was about to take a dramatic and unexpected turn. With the gravity of a surgeon performing a delicate life-or-death operation, Philip took a small, ornate silver letter opener from his desk drawer. He slid the blade carefully under the brittle red wax seal. It cracked with a soft, definitive sound, a sound that seemed to echo in the profound silence of the room. He lifted the lid of the cherry wood box. Inside, nestled on a bed of faded blue velvet, was not a letter, not a key, not some sentimental keepsake. It was a single, sleek, modern object, a silver USB flash drive. Richard stared at it, dumbfounded. "You've got to be kidding me, a USB drive? What is this, 2005? Philip ignored the jibe. He took the drive from the box, plugged it into a port on his laptop with a quiet click, and tapped a few keys on his keyboard. A large flat-screen monitor on the wall behind his desk, previously dark, flickered to life. My breath caught in my throat. It was Victor. The memory that surfaced as the USB drive was being plugged into the laptop was not a pleasant one. It was raw and painful, a deep wound that had scabbed over but never quite healed. It was from about 15 years ago. Richard was 25, long past the age of boyish mistakes, yet he seemed to be determined to make a career out of them, each one more expensive and damaging than the last. Victor had a singular passion outside of his business: classic cars. It was his one true indulgence, a connection to a world of beauty and mechanics that was a respite from the brutal world of corporate finance. His prized possession, the crown jewel of his small collection, was a 1955 Mercedes-Benz 300 SL Gullwing. It was a magnificent silver bird, a rolling sculpture he had spent years and a small fortune having restored to perfection. He loved that car more than any of his properties, more than his expensive Swiss watches. He said it was a masterpiece of engineering, a work of art that you could also drive. It was kept in a specially built, climate-controlled garage, and only he was allowed to drive it. One Tuesday afternoon, I came home from a charity committee meeting to find Victor in his study. He wasn't working. He was sitting motionless in his large leather chair, his face ashen, his hands clenched into white-knuckled fists on the polished surface of his desk. He was staring at a letter, an official-looking document on heavy bond paper. "What is it, Victor?" I had asked, my heart sinking. I had never seen him look so utterly defeated. He didn't speak. He just slid the letter across the desk toward me. It was from a well-known classic car collector in California. It was a formal inquiry from the car's new owner asking for a minor discrepancy in the original service history documentation that Victor had in his files. New owner. The word seemed to leap off the page and slap me in the face. The full, ugly story came out in jagged, painful pieces over the next hour. Richard,
drowning in gambling debts he had masterfully hidden from us, had committed a crime. He had hired a forger to create a duplicate title for the Mercedes. He had found a shady broker who asked no questions, sold his father's masterpiece for less than half of its market value, and used the cash to pay off a bookie who was threatening to break his legs. He hadn't just sold a car. He had stolen and sold a piece of his father's soul for a quick fix. The confrontation that night was the worst I had ever witnessed in our family. Victor's voice, usually so controlled and measured, was a roar of pure, undiluted rage and betrayal. It wasn't about the money. It wasn't even really about the car. It was about the calculated deceit, the utter lack of respect, of honor, of character. "I gave you everything," Victor had bellowed, his face inches from his son's, his body trembling with a fury that terrified me. "Every advantage, every opportunity, a world-class education you barely used, a job you don't deserve, a name you have now dragged through the mud, and this is what you do? You steal from me? From your own family?" Richard, cornered and terrified, did what he always did when confronted with the consequences of his actions. He crumbled. He wept, he babbled, he begged for forgiveness. He made 1,000 passionate, empty promises to change. And I, fool that I was, did what I always did. I stepped in. I became the buffer, the peacemaker, the soft heart that couldn't bear to see her family torn apart. "Victor, please," I'd pleaded, physically putting myself between them as if Victor might actually strike him. "He's our son. He made a terrible, terrible mistake. He knows what he did was wrong." I will never forget the look Victor gave me in that moment. It was not angry. It was something far worse. It was weary. A profound, soul-deep weariness that seemed to age him 10 years in 10 seconds. "Amelia," he'd said, his voice dropping to a harsh, broken whisper, "this is not a mistake. A mistake is forgetting to pay a bill. A mistake is taking a wrong turn. This is a choice. This is a calculated act of betrayal. This is his character." I didn't want to believe it. I couldn't. I spent the next week on the phone, a desperate mother trying to undo the damage. I tracked down the new owner in California. I pleaded with him. I offered to pay him double what he had paid Richard, using money from my own personal savings account. But the man was a legitimate collector. He knew what he had acquired it legally, and he wasn't selling. The silver bird was gone forever. Afterward, I went to Richard. He was holed up in his expensive apartment, wallowing in self-pity. I gave him a check. It was for $50,000. "This is to help you get your life in order," I'd told him, my voice trembling with a mixture of love and disappointment. "Pay off whatever remaining debts you have, but this is the last time, Richard. I will not do this again. You have to learn to stand on your own." He took the check, his eyes still red from his crocodile tears, and promised me he would. He promised he would make us proud. Looking back now, sitting in that silent lawyer's office, I saw the scene with a terrible, searing clarity. My act of love, my desperate attempt to salvage our son, had not been a kindness. It had been an enablement. I had taught him that actions have no real consequences, that Mom would always be there with her checkbook to clean up the mess. Victor had been right. It wasn't a mistake. It was his character. And I realized, with a cold dread that settled deep in my stomach, that his character had not changed one bit. It had only festered, growing more entitled and arrogant with each passing year, culminating in the smug, cruel man sitting across from me, a man who was waiting for a fortune he had done nothing to earn and everything to prove he didn't deserve. The face on the screen was undeniably Victor, but it was a version of him from before the illness had truly taken hold. The puffiness from the steroids was gone, his jawline was sharp and defined, and his eyes, those intelligent, piercing brown eyes that could see right through any bluff, were clear and intensely focused. He was wearing a simple gray cashmere sweater and sitting in his favorite worn leather armchair in the library, a fire crackling softly in the grand stone fireplace behind him. He looked healthy. He looked powerful. He looked directly into the camera lens, and it felt as if he could see right through the screen, right into the tense, silent room where we all sat. His gaze was fixed, and it was aimed squarely at our son. Richard, if you are watching this, it means my will has been read, and your initial inheritance has been dispensed. It also means your greed has, as I fully expected, outpaced your grief. Richard flinched as if he'd been physically struck. The color drained from his face, leaving it pasty, mottled white. Jennifer, his wife, ever the supportive spouse in public, reached out and put a hand on his arm, but he shook it off with a sharp, irritated motion. I know you believe the company, the money, all of it, is your birthright. It is a belief your mother and I are, regrettably, partly responsible for instilling in you. We gave you too much and demanded too little in return. We shielded you from the consequences of your actions, hoping you would eventually grow into the responsibilities that awaited you. We were wrong. He paused, letting the silence stretch, a tactic he often used in negotiations to make the other party uncomfortable. In the office, you could have heard a pin drop. My own breathing was shallow. My hands clenched so tightly in my lap, my knuckles were white and aching. A company is not a toy, Richard. An empire is not a playground. It is a living, breathing entity built on the sweat, sacrifice, and trust of thousands of employees and their families who depend on it for their livelihood, for their mortgages, for their children's college funds. It requires a steady hand, a sharp mind, and above all, integrity. It requires a character you have yet to demonstrate. He leaned forward slightly in his chair, his eyes seeming to narrow, his voice dropping to a lower, more personal register. I know about your debts. Don't look so surprised. I have always known. I know about the investment opportunities in Macau that are nothing more than high-stakes gambling. I know you see Wilson Motors as not a legacy to be nurtured, but a personal bank to be plundered, a solution to the problems of your own making. I will not allow the work of my entire life, the foundation that supports so many families, to be destroyed by your recklessness and your insatiable appetite for the easy way out. Richard was visibly shrinking in his chair. His earlier arrogance was completely gone, replaced by a pale, slack-jawed disbelief. He looked like a boy who had been caught with his hand in the cookie jar, utterly exposed and without defense. Then, Victor's expression softened. The hard lines around his mouth relaxed, and he turned his head slightly, as if looking at someone just off camera. And I knew, with every fiber of my being, he was thinking of me. An empire, he said, his voice now softer, more reflective, is only as strong as its foundation. A skyscraper is nothing without the bedrock it rests upon. And my foundation, the bedrock upon which everything I ever built rests, has always been your mother. My breath hitched in my throat. A single tear I hadn't realized was forming escaped and traced a hot, surprising path down my cheek. She came to me when I had nothing but a crazy idea and a garage full of spare parts. She worked beside me, believed in me when my own father told me to give up, and she sacrificed her own small dreams so that mine could have a chance to live. She managed our home with the efficiency of a CIO, she raised our child, and she created a world of stability and grace that allowed me to go out and fight the dragons every single day. She never held a title at Wilson Motors, she never sat on the board, but her fingerprints are on every success this company has ever had. She is the co-founder in everything but name. He looked back at the camera, his gaze once again hard and direct, a silent warning to anyone who would dare underestimate the woman he was speaking of. She has the one thing you lack, Richard: character.
And she has a business acumen you have never bothered, or perhaps never been wise enough to recognize." He fell silent. The video wasn't over, I could tell, but his main address was. He had passed judgment. In the quiet hum of the laptop's fan, I felt 45 years of being overlooked, of being the silent partner, of being just mom, begin to fall away like a heavy, suffocating cloak. He had seen me. All this time, through all the noise and the success and the distance that had grown between us, he had truly seen me. The image of Victor on the screen remained, a silent, powerful presence presiding over the room. The only sound was the soft crackling of the fireplace in the video and the frantic, shallow breathing of my son. Richard was frozen, his face a mask of stunned, impotent fury. He looked from the screen to Philip Alcott, then to me, his eyes wild and searching for someone to blame for this public dismantling of his ego, this utter negation of his life's expectations. Then, Victor's expression returned, pulling our attention back to the screen. He was no longer looking at the camera with that intense personal gaze. He was looking down, as if reading from a formal document resting on his lap. "Therefore," he said, his voice now stripped of all emotion, formal and legalistic, "I, Victor Thomas Wilson, being of sound mind and body, do hereby enact the following special clause or codicil to my last will and testament to be executed upon my death." Philip Alcott reached out and paused the video. He picked up the main document of the will from his desk and flipped to the last page. He began to read aloud, his voice echoing the intent of the man on the screen. "All remaining assets of my estate, including the controlling 65% share of Wilson Motors stock and all liquid assets held in the associated investment portfolios, estimated at a current value of $37.5 million, are to be placed into a revocable living trust, effective immediately." He looked up from the page, his eyes meeting mine with a gravity that made my stomach clench. Richard finally found his voice. It was a strangled, incredulous croak, the sound of a man whose entire reality had just been shattered. "What? No, that's not possible. He can't do that. The bylaws, my position as director—" "He can, and he has," Philip said, his tone as cold and hard as steel, leaving no room for argument. "The majority shareholder can appoint whomever they wish as trustee. It's perfectly legal and ironclad." He returned his gaze to the document. "This transfer of control, however, comes with a condition." My heart, which had been soaring with a terrifying, exhilarating emotion, suddenly plummeted. A condition. Of course. Victor was always a strategist, a chess player. He never made a move without thinking 3 steps ahead. Richard leaned forward, his face contorted with a desperate, predatory gleam. He saw it. Not a condition designed to test me, but a loophole designed for him to exploit. A battleground, a fight he was absolutely certain he could win. He looked at me, and for the first time that day he saw not his mother, not an old woman, but an opponent, and a weak one at that. An old woman who had spent the last 30 years planning charity galas and picking out upholstery. What did I know about running a multi-million-dollar corporation? How could I possibly win the confidence of a board of directors filled with ruthless, sharp-suited men who had known him for years, played golf with him, and seen him as the heir apparent? 30 days, Richard said, almost to himself, the words tasting sweet on his tongue. He stood up, slowly this time, and buttoned his suit jacket in a gesture of renewed purpose. He was no longer the chastised schoolboy. He was a general, surveying a battlefield he was convinced was his for taking. He gave me a look of such condescending pity it made my skin crawl. He said, "Well, Mom," the word mom dripping with a newfound, biting sarcasm. "Good luck with that. You're gonna need it." He turned on his heel and strode out of the office, his back ramrod straight. Jennifer, her face a confused mixture of panic and calculation, scrambled to follow him. The door slammed shut behind them, the sound a declaration of war.
The room was silent again, save for the quiet hum of the expensive computer. Philip Alcott turned off the video, and Victor's face disappeared, leaving me alone with the enormity of what had just happened. Victor hadn't just given me an inheritance, he had given me a fight. He had thrown me into the lion's den, not as a victim to be devoured, but with the quiet, unshakable belief that I was strong enough to tame the lions. I looked at Philip, my mind reeling, 1,000 panicked thoughts swirling. "He expects me to fight him," I whispered, the words tasting foreign and impossible on my tongue. Philip gave me a small, sad smile, his eyes full of a deep understanding. "No, Amelia," he said gently, his voice firm. "He expects you to win." The first blow came less than 48 hours later. It was subtle, insidious, and far more clever than I would have given Richard credit for. He didn't launch a direct legal challenge to the will. Philip had assured me it was ironclad, and Richard's own lawyers must have told him the same. Instead, he attacked the one thing he knew was vulnerable, the one thing he could manipulate: my reputation. I was in the kitchen of the large, silent mansion, staring into a refrigerator full of gourmet food I had no appetite for, when my phone buzzed with an insistent, jarring rhythm. It was Eleanor, my best friend since our college days, my rock and my confidant for nearly 50 years. "Amelia, have you seen the Financial Chronicle online this morning?" she asked, her voice tight with anger she was barely containing. There was no preamble, no, "How are you holding up?" Just a call to arms. "The what? Ellie, you know I don't read those papers. They're all just noise." "Well, you need to see this one. It's not noise, it's a torpedo aimed right at you. I'm sending you a link. Brace yourself and call me back." The link arrived a moment later with a soft chime. I tapped on it, my hand trembling slightly. It took me to a well-known financial news website, on a page that was more gossip column than serious journalism, but was read by everyone on Wall Street. The headline jumped out at me in bold, accusatory letters that seemed to scream from the screen. "Wilson Motors in turmoil? Widow and lawyer in shock power grab as dutiful sons sidelined." My breath caught in my chest as if I'd been punched. I scrolled down, my horror growing with every venomous word. The article, quoting several sources close to the family, painted a lurid and completely distorted picture. It spoke of a grieving, emotionally unstable widow, me, being manipulated by a longtime family lawyer with his own agenda. It spoke of Victor's declining health and questionable mental state in his final months, heavily implying he was not of sound mind when he made his final decisions. It portrayed Richard as the devastated but dutiful son, fighting valiantly to protect his father's precious legacy from being dismantled by those who do not understand the complexities of modern business. It was a masterpiece of character assassination. Every word was a carefully chosen poison dart. They hadn't told a single outright lie, not technically. They had just twisted the truth into a grotesque new shape, one designed to make me look weak, incompetent, and hysterical, while making Richard look like a tragic, misunderstood hero. The phone rang again before I could even process the article. This time, the caller ID showed the main number for Wilson Motors. I hesitated, then answered. It was David Chen, the chief operating officer of the company. He was a good man, fiercely loyal to Victor for over 20 years, and someone I had always liked. "Amelia," he said, and his voice was strained, uncomfortable. I'm so sorry to bother you at a time like this. I just wanted to give you a heads up. The phones have been ringing off the hook all morning. The investors are spooked by that article. The stock is down nearly 8% in pre-market trading." He hesitated, and I could hear the deep discomfort in his voice. "Amelia, Richard has been calling the other board members directly. He's telling them he's trying to stage a rescue to save the company from chaos." The floor seemed to tilt beneath my feet. I had to grip the edge of the cold marble countertop to steady myself. This was Richard's strategy. It was brilliant in its cruelty. He wasn't going to fight me with lawyers in a courtroom. He was going to fight me with whispers and innuendo in the court of public opinion.
He was going to create a crisis and then present himself as the only possible solution. In 30 days, when the board had to vote on their confidence in me, they would be looking at a woman who, on paper, had presided over a stock collapse and a public relations nightmare. They would be desperate for stability, and he would be standing there offering it on a silver platter. For a long, terrifying moment, a wave of pure, unadulterated panic washed over me. I wanted to run. I wanted to call Richard and tell him to take it all. The money, the company, the stress, the humiliation. It wasn't worth this. I was 67 years old. I was a widow. I just wanted peace. I sank into a kitchen chair, my head in my hands. The silence of the large empty house pressed in on me, suffocating me. "Victor, what have you done?" I thought. A wave of despair so profound, it felt like a physical illness washing over me. Why would you put me through this? The image of his face on the video screen flashed in my mind. His clear, confident eyes. His unwavering belief. He expects you to win. And then another memory. The one of my younger self at the kitchen table, finding the flaw in the financial report that had saved his company from a disaster. I hadn't been an expert then either. I had just been a person who cared, who paid attention, who refused to be intimidated by a wall of numbers and jargon. The panic began to recede. It was replaced by a slow, burning ember of anger, a righteous, cleansing anger. How dare he? How dare Richard paint me as some fragile, witless creature for the world to pity? After everything I had done, everything I had been, he had mistaken my quietness for weakness. He had mistaken my kindness for stupidity. It was a mistake many people had made over the years. It was a mistake he was going to live to regret. I stood up from the chair, my back straight, my resolve hardening like steel. The chill in my bones was gone, replaced by a fire I hadn't felt in decades. I picked up my phone. I didn't call Richard. I didn't call the newspaper. I called the one person I knew I could trust to be in my corner no matter what. "Eleanor," I said when she picked up on the first ring, my voice low and steady. "I canceled my appointments for the next month. All of them. I have work to do."
The next morning, I drove myself to Philip Alcott's office. I didn't wait for him to call me with more bad news. I walked into the hushed, wood-paneled reception area unannounced. The offending newspaper article, now printed out, clutched in my hand like a weapon. His longtime secretary, a kind woman named Doris, looked up, her face a mixture of surprise and sympathy. Before she could speak, I was already walking toward the heavy oak door of his office. I found him on the phone, his back to me, staring out the large window at the city below. He was speaking in low, placating tones, the voice of a man trying to calm a spooked horse. "I understand your concern, Mr. Henderson. I truly do. But I assure you, the estate is being handled with the utmost professionalism and in accordance with Mr. Wilson's explicit wishes." I walked up to his massive desk and dropped the printed article onto his leather blotter with a sharp, definitive slap. He turned, saw the paper, then saw the look on my face. He held up a hand to me, a silent request for a moment, and quickly ended his call. "Arthur, I'll have to call you back." He hung up the phone and let out a long, weary sigh, rubbing the bridge of his nose between his thumb and forefinger. "Amelia, I was just about to call you. I've been fielding calls from half the board all morning. Arthur Henderson is leading the charge. He's worried about the stock price, about the company's image." "They're not fighting with lawyers, Philip," I said, my voice hard and devoid of the tremor I felt inside. "They're fighting with whispers and lies, and right now, they're winning." "I know," he admitted, his shoulders slumping slightly. He looked older than he had 2 days ago. It's a classic corporate raider tactic, a smear campaign. Destabilize from the outside, create panic among the shareholders, then present yourself as the only one who can restore order. It's vicious, and it's often very effective. "So what do we do?" I asked, looking him straight in the eye, challenging him.
Do we issue a press release denying everything? Do I go on television and defend myself in Victor's memory? He shook his head slowly but firmly. No, that's exactly what they want. They want to drag you into a public mud wrestling match. You'll never win that way. They'll twist your every word, edit any interview to make you look foolish or angry. We can't fight them on their turf, in the media. He paused, a thoughtful, calculating look coming over his face. We have to fight them on yours. What is my turf? I asked, a note of bitterness in my voice. The garden? The charity committee luncheon? No, he said, and a faint, determined smile touched his lips. The boardroom. We don't fight whispers with more words. We fight them with competence, with data, with results. We prove them wrong, not by what you say to a reporter, but by what you do for the company. A sense of purpose, clear and sharp, began to crystallize within me. He was right. This wasn't a popularity contest. It was a test of leadership, and I would not fail. I need everything, Philip, I said, my voice gaining strength with every word. Every financial report, every quarterly projection, every market analysis for the last 5 years. I want to know every division, every project, every success, and more importantly, every failure. I want the personnel files of every board member and every division head. I want to know where all the bodies are buried. His smile widened. This was a language he understood. I was hoping you'd say that. Victor left very specific instructions in a private letter to me. He granted you, through my office, full and unrestricted access to all company data, effective immediately. He knew you'd need the ammunition. He gestured to a stack of thick, intimidating binders on a nearby credenza. Your homework, Mrs. Wilson. Welcome to your new full-time job. I spent the next 2 weeks in a self-imposed exile. My beautiful, lonely home became a war room. The grand dining room table, which had once hosted lavish dinner parties for senators and CEOs, was now buried on a mountain of paperwork. I worked 18-hour days, fueled by endless cups of black coffee and a burning desire to prove every single one of them wrong. I read until my eyes burned and the numbers started to swim on the page. I made notes, I created spreadsheets, I asked Philip questions, and then I asked more questions, digging deeper and deeper into the complex machinery of the company Victor had built. Slowly, over long days and even longer nights, a picture began to emerge. It was a picture of a solid, successful company, but one that had begun to stagnate, to rest on its laurels. Victor had been ill for the last couple of years, and his legendary focus had wavered. And Richard, who had been given control over the entire European division as a test of his promotion readiness, was asleep at the wheel. The division wasn't just underperforming, it was bleeding money, a fact that was cleverly obscured in the overall corporate reports by the strong and steady performance of the North American branch. One night, utterly exhausted and overwhelmed, I called Eleanor. I poured out my fears, my frustrations, the crushing weight of it all. I don't know if I can do this, Ellie, I confessed, my voice cracking with the fatigue that was more than just physical. These men on the board, they've known Richard for years. They see me as his mother, as Victor's grieving wife. They don't see me. There was a pause on the other end of the line. Then Eleanor's voice, firm and unwavering as it had been for 50 years, came through the receiver. Then make them see you, Amelia. You are not just Victor's wife, you were his partner. You helped build that company from a garage. Victor knew it. That's why he did this. He didn't leave you a burden. He left you a crown he knew you were worthy of wearing. Her voice softened, but lost none of its steel. Now stop feeling sorry for yourself. Get 8 hours of sleep for the first time in a week, and then get back to work. You have a company to run. I hung up the phone, my friend's words echoing in the silent room. A crown. The thought was both terrifying and exhilarating. She was right. I wasn't fighting for money or for revenge. I was fighting for my own legacy,
the one that had been written in invisible ink for 45 years. It was time to make it visible. The day of the emergency board meeting arrived. It was a gray, overcast morning, the sky the color of bruised plums, a perfect mirror for my nervous, churning mood. I stood in front of my large walk-in closet, my hand hovering over the rows of conservative black, navy, and charcoal suits I had worn for years to funerals, charity luncheons, and formal dinners. They were the clothes of a widow, the uniform of a background figure. They were safe. They were invisible.
On a sudden, defiant impulse, I pushed them aside. My hand landed on a dress I hadn't worn in years, one I had bought for a long-ago anniversary dinner. It was a deep emerald green, the color of new life, the color of power, the color of money. It was a beautifully tailored sheath dress with a matching jacket. It was a power dress. I put it on. Instead of my usual soft, matronly bun, I had my hairdresser style my silver hair in a sleek, elegant chignon at the nape of my neck. I wore the simple pearl earrings Victor had given me for our 40th anniversary and a touch of lipstick. When I looked in the mirror, I didn't see a grieving, frightened widow. I saw Amelia Wilson, chairman of the board. Philip Alcott met me in the cavernous, marble-floored lobby of the Wilson Motors Tower. He was holding a slim leather briefcase. He took in my appearance, his eyes widening almost imperceptibly. A slow, appreciative smile spread across his face. "Well," he said with a small, approving nod, "look out, world." The boardroom was on the top floor, a long, intimidating room with a polished black granite table so large it felt like a frozen lake. It reflected the stormy sky outside, making the room feel dark and ominous. The board members, a dozen men in expensive dark suits, were already seated. They were the titans of industry, the old guard who had worked with Victor for decades. They looked at me as I entered, their expressions ranging from polite pity to outright, unconcealed skepticism. I could read their minds. What is the old woman doing here? This is no place for her. Richard and Jennifer were sitting at the far end of the table, positioned as if they were already in charge. Richard looked smug, supremely confident. He had spent the last 3 weeks poisoning the well, sowing seeds of doubt and panic, and he believed his victory was a foregone conclusion. He gave me a nod that was more of a dismissal than a greeting. The meeting began. The chairman, a stern-faced man named Arthur Henderson, whom I had known socially for years, called the meeting to order. The preliminary reports were read by the CFO. The stock was still down. The mood was tense and grim. Then Arthur turned to Richard. "Richard," he said, his voice heavy, "you requested this emergency meeting. The floor is yours." Richard stood up, a mask of feigned solemnity and deep concern on his face. He was a consummate actor. He spoke about his deep love for his father, about his father's incredible legacy. He spoke about the company's sudden, worrying instability, the fear among the shareholders, and the urgent need for a steady, experienced hand during this difficult and emotional transition. He spoke of his lifelong dedication to the company and his fervent desire to honor his father's vision. He never mentioned me by name, referring to me only as my mother, but his implication was as clear as glass. I was the chaos, he was the solution. He was smooth, polished, and utterly convincing. When he sat down, I could feel the sentiment in the room shifting decisively in his favor. Several board members nodded in grave agreement. Then Arthur Henderson turned his cool, appraising gaze on me. "Mrs. Wilson," he said, his tone polite but distant, "do you have anything to add?" This was it, my one chance.
My heart was pounding against my ribs like a trapped bird, but I pushed the fear down. I stood up slowly, my hands resting lightly on the back of my heavy leather chair. I didn't look at Richard. I looked at the faces around the table, meeting each man's gaze one by one, holding it for a second too long, forcing them to see me. "Gentlemen," I began, my voice clear and steady, surprising even myself with its strength. "My son is right about one thing. This company needs a steady hand. It needs a leader who is focused on its future, not just on sentimental stories about its past." I paused, letting that sink in. Then I reached down and picked up a slim green binder I had placed in front of me, its green color matching my dress. "Which is why I'd like to talk about Europe." A ripple of confusion went through the room. This was not what they were expecting. Richard's head snapped up, his confident smirk faltering for the first time. "For the last 2 years," I continued, opening the binder to a tabbed section, "the European division under your leadership has been underperforming. To be more precise, it has posted a net loss of $19 million, a fact that has been skillfully masked in the consolidated reports by the strong, consistent performance of our domestic operations." I didn't raise my voice. I didn't sound accusatory. I simply stated the facts, my tone as cool and polished as the table in front of me. I laid out the numbers, the missed quarterly targets, the failed product launches in Germany, the disastrous marketing campaign in France. I had done my homework. I knew every skeleton in that division's closet. "The strategy has been unfocused, the marketing has been ineffective, and the leadership has been, to put it kindly, absentee." Richard jumped to his feet, his face flushed with anger and surprise. "That's a lie. The European market is complex. It's facing headwinds. You don't understand." "Please sit down, Richard," Arthur Henderson said, his voice sharp and impatient. He was no longer looking at Richard. He was looking at me now with a new, intense interest. I took a deep breath, feeling a surge of adrenaline. "But I am here today not to talk about past failures. I am here to talk about future solutions." For the next 10 minutes, I laid out my plan, a detailed, 3-step strategy to restructure the entire European division. It involved divesting from the 2 most unprofitable product lines, reallocating the capital to bolster our 2 most promising markets in the UK and Scandinavia, and appointing a new, dynamic, local manager, a woman named Ingrid Larsson from our Swedish office, whose stellar performance I had discovered deep in the personnel reports. It was bold, it was data-driven, and it was irrefutable. I had anticipated their questions, and I had the answers ready. When I finished, a profound silence descended upon the room. It was a different kind of silence this time. It was the silence of shock, of reassessment, of respect. The board members were looking from the concise, powerful summary in my report, then back at me, their expressions completely transformed. They were no longer looking at Victor Wilson's grieving widow. They were looking at a leader. David Chen, the COO, the man who had called me with such trepidation weeks ago, was the first to speak. His voice was filled with a genuine, undisguised awe. "Amelia, Mrs. Wilson, that is the most coherent, insightful, and actionable analysis of the European problem I have heard in 2 years. He turned to the rest of the board, his conviction absolute. "I, for one, have no doubts about where the future of this company lies."
Every single hand around the table went up. Instantly. Unhesitatingly. It was over. I had won. The aftermath of the board meeting was swift and brutal. A corporate execution carried out with quiet, ruthless efficiency.
Every single hand around the table went up. Instantly. Unhesitatingly. It was over. I had won. The aftermath of the board meeting was swift and brutal. A corporate execution carried out with quiet, ruthless efficiency. The news of my unanimous confirmation and Richard's public humiliation spread through the financial community like wildfire. The narrative Richard had so carefully and cruelly crafted, that of the dutiful son trying to save a legacy from his unstable mother, was shattered in a single, decisive afternoon. He was no longer the tragic hero of his own story. He was the incompetent heir who had been thoroughly and publicly outmaneuvered by the very person he had underestimated the most. The friends who had flocked to him in the days after the will reading, anticipating a life of lavish parties, easy loans, and lucrative no-show consulting gigs, vanished like mist in the morning sun. The creditors who had been patient and accommodating, assuming he was about to inherit a vast fortune, suddenly became aggressive and demanding. The walls he had built around himself, walls made of his father's money and his father's reputation, came crumbling down around him, leaving him exposed and alone.
A fortune without the strength to protect it is not a gift, it is a curse. I had to know that you would not just inherit an empire, but that you would be capable of commanding it. I had to give you the chance to show the world, and more importantly, to show yourself, the brilliant, powerful, and courageous woman I have always known you to be. I didn't leave you a crown, my love. I left you the opportunity to forge your own. And I never doubted for a single second that you would. The $38 million is just paper. The company is just bricks and mortar. My true legacy, the only thing I am unequivocally proud of when I look back on my life, is the life we built together from nothing. It is you. You were the woman who never let me fall. Live well, my Amelia. Be happy. Travel. See the world. Run the company into the ground or turn it into the biggest corporation on earth. It is yours. You've earned it. Forever yours, Victor. Tears streamed down my face as I read the letter, but they were not tears of sadness or grief. They were tears of release, of gratitude, of a love so deep and complex that it had transcended even death to give me one final, perfect gift. It wasn't the money or the company. It was the validation, the knowledge that I had been seen truly and completely by the one person whose opinion had always mattered most. I folded the letter carefully and placed it back in the envelope, holding it close to my heart. I looked out over the peaceful grounds at the vast blue sky above. My son had lost an empire he never deserved, but I, Amelia Wilson, had not just regained my life, I had finally, at 67 years old, stepped out of the long, comfortable shadow of a great man and claimed my own place in the sun. And it was just the beginning.